Hello everybody, it's Thorfinn here, and today what I wanted to do is kind of a video that I think really no one has done, right? And that's kind of sharing like some things that you'll hear players say when they're like VOD reviewing or watch partying, just kind of not necessarily like slang words, but more of just like words that get thrown around a lot, but not necessarily explained. This is kind of a guide to VOD reviewing lingo and kind of pro terminology, right? The first thing we're going to cover here is something pretty simple. This is going to be macro. All right, so macro is pretty easy to understand. Macro is just kind of basic large principles, right? So for example, if you're on the attack side and your goal is to take mid every round, right? This is sort of a macro call, right? A macro play, pretty much a big scale idea that's not necessarily ironed out in terms of like exactly how you do it, more of just like, hey, we need to do this, right? Obviously, it can include more specific solutions, especially like at the pro level and at the like competitive level, right? But you use macro ideas in your ranked games, right? Like, hey, like, let's take B, or like, hey, let's take A, right? And then leave someone A, and then go back B, or like go back mid, take mid control, and then come back A, right? Basically things like that that are super kind of broad and generalized. Is most of the time when everyone talks about macro, or like, hey, this ideal has good macro, this team has good macro. That's what it is, right? Now, we're going to talk about pretty much not really the opposite, but what will be thrown around there is micro. So micro most of the time is talking about more like the specific details, right? Like, hey, we're going to take B, and like a good micro play would be, hey, like we have a Sova dart that pings right here, right? To stop this B main push. That's like a micro play. A lot of the time you'll hear micro being described as how a player plays, right? Like how they throw a trip or a cage, or exactly how they swing something, or like pretty much how a player approaches the game. Like a lot of the time you'll hear like, hey, like this guy has a really good understanding of like the macro of the game, but the micro of the game not so much, right? Like when to throw utility, how to throw utility, like when to swing, when to not, things like that, right? Is kind of all talked about in micro, right? So next I want to talk about a swing round. So a swing round is essentially a momentum change, kind of how you think of a swing round, right? So let's say there's been 4 rounds won from the attackers, right? Straight in a row. So they have, so let's say that in this scenario, even though they've won 4 in a row, each round has been extremely close, right? And this next round, right, would be a swing round if their money is really bad. Let's say that they're all buying down to 0, and so are you, right? Or even like you're not, right? This is a swing round. So essentially what a swing round is will it break their momentum? Like for example, if they all have bad money and they lose this round, right? This white becomes a blue for the defenders, right? The next round, the attacking side will be on eco, which will lead to another round, right? And then that'll lead to a bonus round here, right? Pretty much think of like basically resetting the game is kind of how I think of what a swing round is, right? You'll hear this a lot, especially in like T-Dog's videos and stuff like that. And I think not a lot of people really understand what a swing round is. So next we're going to go into, oh my, I don't know why it keeps doing this. We're going into ecos. Ecos are pretty simple, right? So if you are saving money, aka minus $0, okay, that is going to be an eco round, right? Now a half buy, which we'll talk about as well, pretty simple. I don't know why it keeps doing this, but whatever. We're gonna live with it and we're just gonna move past it. So a half buy would be if you have, let's say you have 3,500 credits, right? So a half buy would be, of course, like buying to half of that, which roughly off the top of my head, that would be like 1250. So like half armor, a ghost, some utility, right? Basically, why you would do a half buy is if you have like this number of credits, right? Where, yeah, you can force rifles, but you're not going to have a lot of utility. You can force like a bulldog or something like that, but again, you're really not going to be able to be in the best scenario to fight up against the same weaponry the opponents have. So you split the difference. You only spend like half your credits, so you can have more than enough credits than you need into the next round to ensure that you have the best chance of winning, right? Now, forcing. So, forcing is one thing that kind of gets caught up with like, even like Ascendant and Immortal players, right, that really don't understand kind of the lingo. So, forcing is not buying in the second round, right? Like, if you win this first round, win the second round, you're playing an anti-eco because the other team is going to save most likely, which means it's an eco round, right? Which we talked about like literally a minute ago. So an anti-eco is ensuring that you spend all the money you can to put yourself in the best possible position to win against an eco buy, right? So most of the time what you'll see teams do is they'll have like 2 ghosts and they'll have 3 rifles, whether it be Bulldog, Guardian, or Vandal, or whatever sort of combination of that, right? Sentinels is really the only one that doesn't apply too much of this rule. They kind of buy Stingers, they buy Spectres and stuff like that, right? So forcing would be, let's say, a more realistic force, right? Would it be, you're on attack, the defensive team wins, right? But they survive with like no armor left. They only have like 3,000 something credits. And you think that, hey, right, we got the bomb down, we have like 2,400 apiece. We could buy half armor, Stingers, full utility, and we're close to like an alt, like a Gecko alt maybe, or something like that, right? So a force would be buying into this round, right? Spending all of your money so you're down to 0 credits to try and win this round to flip the momentum, right? That would be what forcing is. So if you win the pistol round, you're not forcing, you're just playing an anti-eco into the next, right? So another round that we need to talk about that I think most people kind of know is an Overwatch round. So how I would explain an Overwatch round, right, is pretty simple. So if you have an Overwatch round is when you have, usually for me, my opinion of Overwatch round is 3 or more ultimates. So you have like these like insane alts, right? Like let's say you have like Gecko Thrash, Breach alt, maybe you have like Raise Rocket, right? You have these alts, and essentially what an Overwatch round is hey, we're not gonna default most of the time. We're not gonna try and do some complex strategy. We're just gonna go to A site or B site, wherever we think that their defense will be the weakest, and we're just gonna slap all of our alts most of the time just straight down on their heads to ensure that we win this round, right? You'll see a lot of teams use this to guarantee gun rounds, but you'll also see some teams use Overwatch rounds in different scenarios. Like EG, Champs EG, if you guys remember, a lot of the times they won rounds off of Stingers and Ultimates, and that's kind of one way you can use an Overwatch round, is using a bunch of alts that just give you an advantage in the game to counteract the disadvantage you have of guns, right? Okay, so now that we're done with Overwatch rounds, right, we're gonna go into so X dash X. So you'll see this sort of combo of phrasing, whether it be like a 1-3-1 or a 1-2-1 or things like that, right? So I'm gonna kind of explain it pretty simply here. So just push that again so you guys can see that here. So essentially what this means, right, is look at the map layout depending on where you are. Most of the time this is used on attack. So if it's like a 1-3-1, for example, that means you're gonna have 1 towards B, you're gonna have 3 towards mid, and you're gonna have 1 towards A, right? Pretty simple. This is kind of inclusive into defaulting most of the time, right? Most of the time when you make a default, you'll use this terminology to kind of decide how the default will run, which I'll get more into that in a second. But sometimes it doesn't have to be like a 1-3-1. Sometimes you'll hear like, for example, here like a 4-1. So a 4-1 would just be from the left side to this, right? sometimes people will clarify like, hey, we're going to have a 4-1, and then they'll say the bomb site. So if they're like, hey, let's have a 4-1A, right? Most of the time what this means is you'll have one guy towards mid, and then you'll have 4 towards the bomb site that is called, right? Okay. Now into defaulting here. So defaulting, a lot of people think that it is, oh, like if you're going to default, you're going to do like a 2-1-2, right? Which is a very typical default where you have 2 people towards each bomb site, and then you have 1 guy towards mid. But realistically, you could have different defaults. I'm going to go onto Lotus here, just because it's an example that I bring up a lot of the time in my videos. But for my past collegiate team, unlike most people, we played double initiator. We played Gecko Breach. So our default was completely different, right? So we had KJ towards A to kind of hold the A space. And then we had everyone else towards this C mound area. Basically, our entire goal of Lotus and our game plan was to default and always have this C control, right? And you'll see that on certain maps. Most of the time, you're really only going to see it on maps that don't have that great of a mid, right? Like Icebox. A lot of teams will, instead of like having like a 1-3-1 or things like that, they'll play super heavy towards one specific side of the map because they think, oh, the alt orb is easy to grab, or oh, this space rotates really well into another space, or oh, hey, if we play this map and the like defending team has this specific area of the map, we always lose. So they'll focus their game plan around making sure that they don't have to deal with that, right? And for us, it was just kind of a alt orb situation, right? Like most of the time on our attack sides, which our attack sides were always like very hit or miss. So my goal here with this was to ensure that we had as many Gecko alts as possible, which Gecko alt is a really easy alt to farm. So I have up to like 3 alts per game, well, per attack half. So if we use them right, and we're really good at ensuring like value, I'll toot my own horn here. I'm really good at ensuring value with a Gecko alt. Essentially what that does is allow us to realistically not worry about 3 rounds. So that means if we win pistol, right, and we add the 3 alts to that, okay, we win pistol, we win the second round after, right? That's 5 rounds minimum on attack. So my game plan or our mid-rounding or, you know, our micro plays don't have to necessarily be as up to par as other teams because of how we set this default, right? So when people say default in ranked, right, usually what they mean is a 2-1-2. But if you hear casters talk about like, hey, they like this C default or A default, most of the time it's just a default that has 3 or more people towards that side of the map, right? But if you hear it in ranked, usually it means a 2-1-2. Very simple. All right, so next, we're going to go into some defensive side of lingo. So, what is a reclear? So a reclear is fairly self-explanatory, but essentially what the idea is, right, is on defense, you can definitely get aggressive and take this space, right? But sometimes teams will opt for a different approach that usually could potentially catch people off guard or counter certain type of plays, right? So let's say you're playing against a team that likes to heavy start towards A, right? And usually leave like 1 or 2 guys towards this A position to hold it and sort of, you know, begin to explore the rest of the map to try and stretch your defense as thin as possible. Now, a reclear is designed to basically minimize that risk. It's an idea of letting the attackers turn this neutral space into attacking space, and then you confront it with utility. A lot of the time for a reclear here, you'll see an Omen Blind, you'll see a Fade Haunt, and then you'll see like a Prowler or potentially like a Raisinade or something like that that'll go this back rebel position. And that's how you'll usually see a reclear, right? Pretty much expending usually like 1 to 2, potentially even 3 pieces of utility to ensure that you can recontrol a space in a round, right? Especially against like double controller comps, this is how most of them run, because with double controller they cut off lines of sight, right? Like for example, the Viper Wall B that comes like this, right? This is really good for holding the space, so a lot of teams really like to push the defenders back towards the bomb site just so they don't have info, right? So passive info. Passive info is pretty simple, right? So passive info is kind of understanding where they can't be, right? Like for example, at the start of a given round, this is a super basic example, right? But immediately at the start of the round, they usually can't be anywhere. Let me redo that. They basically can't be anywhere like near this, right? Like this is essentially like you have passive info that they can't be here at the start of the round, right? Pretty self-explanatory. But most of the time, passive info is just kind of, hey, like they can't be here because we went there already, or they haven't thrown any utility, right? So for example, if there's nothing towards A, right? You kind of have the passive info that they're not A, right? Or at least they're not in this neutral area. Okay. Now, passive info is usually acquired by just like knowledge of the game, of like, hey, if we see like for example, let me just click on that. If we see 3 front B and 2 C, we have passive info that they're not A, right? Pretty simple. Essentially, passive info is info that you get from other information that you collect on the map, right? And hard info, also with passive info, for example, like passive info is throwing a Fade Haunt and scanning nothing, right? Because you don't know exactly where they are, but you know where they aren't, is essentially kind of what you really need to understand with passive information. Okay, hard info is the exact opposite. It's knowing exactly where they are, right? So let's say you jiggle A and you see a deadlock C. That's hard info, right? Or you throw like a Fade Haunt here and it scans this guy. That's hard info, right? Knowing exactly where someone is hard info, right? Pretty self-explanatory. So I've been talking about it for a while now, but I'll finally come into it. And that is neutral areas of the map. So neutral areas of the map are essentially where the spawn barriers are, right? So as you can see, right, anything past this spawn barrier is neutral map control, right? It's neutral on the map. It's not necessarily for the attackers. It's not necessarily for the defenders. Obviously, you could break it down here and say like, hey, like, you know, you can just jiggle outside of A to get this info. So technically it's attacker, whatever, right? But for most of the time, neutral is anything that isn't immediately given at the start of the round. So a lot of the times you fight for this neutral space in like certain ways, whether it be with just like, oh, like you swing it, you hold it, you throw utility at it, you have like a coordinated game plan, whatever, right? Most of the time, you're always trying to fight neutral space. And on sort of the flip side of that is controlled space, right? So controlled space is essentially anything that you hold, right? So getting controlled space up to here, taking over this neutral space. Let me click out of this again. Go with the pen, right? Controlling all of this, right, by getting up here towards rubble is super good, right? It's a controlled space. You know that you have it, right? For example, you know that you have front B, this specific area right here, if you have the Killjoy turret just sitting right here, right? Pretty simple. Most of these are very self-explanatory, but I figure going over it would be fairly important, right? Next. Stall. So stalling utility, right, is essentially utility that creates damage upon going through it, or a status effect upon going through it, that will allow you to not necessarily get kills, but allow your allies here, your teammates, to rotate and it not be as important of the timing of these rotates. So I'm going to go back to a different map here because this map I know offhand what the rotate time is. So if we look at the defending side here of Abyss, there's one thing that, you know, I might be getting the exact second wrongs here, but it's roughly within 17 seconds to go from this A bomb site all the way through CT to B, right? And that's a really long time to rotate. Specifically, if they dash onto a site and then insta-plant the bomb, that means you're only going to have 23 seconds to retake and defuse, right? So, what you really want with stall, right, is to pretty much stop them from planting, right? A lot of the times on maps, there's game plans coordinated around this. The most easy one to understand is Icebox, right, where you play towards B. You have like a nano swarm here to deny the plant, and then you have a Viper molly, right, and then you have another nano swarm, right, and then potentially you have a KO molly, right. Essentially you have a game plan to stall and deny planting to give your teammates more time to rotate. And that's really what anchors are in this game. In Counter-Strike, anchors were usually a lot more aggressive. They were more about optimizing them getting like hard frags, right? Like all of the time you'd put your star player in like a certain position, and then they would be considered kind of like your anchor, where you'd throw them flashes, you'd give them supportive utility in any sense of the word, you'd fight with them, you'd bait for them and things like that to guarantee the most amount of kills on a hit. But in Valorant, anchoring, which kind of goes along with stall, is more about being smart and surviving, right? One way that I like to anchor here is kind of playing a little bit farther up than what most people would think, right? Because in Valorant, you know, if you sit on this bomb site, you're getting utility just thrown at you. So having this sort of setup here where you can sit here and you can stall time and you can make it extremely hard for the attackers to A, kill you, and B, take the bomb site extremely quickly and plant is super important, right? A lot of the time you'll find me playing towards B bomb site. You'll throw a molly here, things like that, right? So that is sort of what anchoring is, right? It's making sure that your teammates have enough time to retake and surviving as long as possible, okay? Now, entry, okay? Entry is pretty simple. It's not necessarily duelist, but it's also not duelist. Entering is basically whoever's going first. A lot of the time on Hard Thieves, you'll see Boostio entry on the Killjoy, and that's because he wants his teammates to bait him. He wants to put his star players in the best position possible. One team that I think you should watch if you want to see an actual entry is Team Heretics, right? Mini Boo is very selfless, and he puts himself in really terrible situations because he knows his teammates will trade him out, right? And he can put himself in horrible positions to know that his teammates will capitalize on that, because it's also sort of pushing the other team to take that advantage, right? For example, sort of dashing like here on, sort of going towards like Jet dashing towards his Jenny position is putting you in a really rough spot. You can get shot from top site, you can get shot from front site, you can get shot from screens, you can get shot from back site here, rafters. There's so many things, right? But as a role of an entry, you're essentially trying to find information, right? Oh, like, hey, I dash in, I see that there's an offender here, there's a guy top rafter. Using your body to find information, right? Now, most of the time in Valorant, you don't necessarily have to do that because of like Sova and Fade, right? So a lot of the times you'll see entries sort of dash in, they'll wait, and then they'll wait for their teammates to come out so they can set up like a double peek or a triple fight or you know, whatever, right? To pretty much guarantee that whoever's going in first and that first fight they're taking is as advantageous as possible. Flex is kind of important. So flex is basically anyone that plays a multitude variety of agents. Doesn't necessarily mean they have to play one set of agents or another, but someone who plays multitudes of agents per map, right? So a flex player would be Zelsis. He plays KJ, he plays Breach, he plays Cypher, he plays like just pretty much a lot of roles for his team. That's kind of really it for me. This is a pretty long video, but I think it's going to be pretty helpful for you guys to understand, like watching these people do VOD reviews and things like that. If there's any phrases that you need me to explain more, just leave it in the comments below, and I'll see you guys later. Peace.